ACT1. London, 17th November, 1791.
You are late,
Peaked Joseph. His familiar furrowed brow opened the door of his shop at number 72 St. Paul's Churchyard. Is he here? I whispered loudly, entering his bookstore. The wooden scent of bookshelves reached my nose as I stepped inside.
Godwin. Well, yes, of course. I told you.
Paine.
Oh,
He smiled.
yes. He shall be here for a few weeks, months perhaps, one would assume.
Joseph paused on the staircase, bent lower and whispered.
He is a quiet, odd sort of fellow. Still, I do admit I have an affinity with him.
As I entered the small, oddly shaped dining room, the antique floorboards bent under my step. Joseph never bothered the owner of his apartment to repair anything. A sullen-looking man, who I assumed to be William Godwin, glanced at me in mid-discussion with Thomas Paine, the latter of whom seated himself at the head of the long wooden table. The English-born American revolutionist reacquainted himself with England for the time being. The purpose of his travel was between himself and his God.
Pray tell us your thoughts on everything in France,
said Thomas.
Oh, hello.
How do you do? I asked as I set myself in a seat. Someone thumped against Joseph's door.
He is here.
In a matter of moments, Joseph's maid returned from downstairs and re-emerged in the dining room with a man I did not recognize behind her.
Madames and messieurs, this is Olauda Equiano,
said Joseph. Thomas Paine rose and bowed.
The pleasure is mine, Mr. Equiano. How do you do?
Well, sir, indeed.
Olauda rounded the wooden table and posted himself in one of the empty chairs beside me.
Anne's prepared us her delightful soup.
Joseph's maid poured us each a small bowl of boiled vegetables and a glass of French wine.
By the way, this is Mary Wollstonecraft from London. She works for our Analytical Review and writes. Mary is reaching the end of vindication, which is quite thrilling.
A pleasure. I raised my wine to Olauda.
Thomas Paine, a name synonymous with American nationalism, left an enduring mark on the nation's history. I'm sure he's willing to share his rich trove of stories about the American Revolution. Waiting to be unveiled and shared with us this evening, Olympe de Gouge.
Hello.
A playwright and philosopher from Paris, Helen Maria Williams, who has returned from Paris. And over here, William Godwin, another philosopher.
Olauda smiled at each of us as he made himself comfortable. Have you travelled far, Olauda? I asked as each of us started our soup.
Very, Mrs. Wollstonecraft,
Mr. Equiano, I now recalled where I remember your name,
said Helen.
You are the writer of his own narrative. Mr. Johnson here sold it a few years ago now.
Olauda nodded.
My memoir, you are correct, Miss Williams, though I believe those who publish their own memoirs cannot escape the imputation of vanity. It is also my misfortune what is extraordinary and uncommon is rarely, if ever, believed.
I believe you. A brilliant narrative we must share for our world to change,
said Joseph, smiling before continuing to eat.
Aye. Africa appeared quite curious indeed, but I too believe you, sir.
Joseph removed himself from the table and disappeared down the stairs to his bookstore, returning with Olauda's book. Despite the hardships he endured as a former slave, an air of quiet determination hung about him. His voice, rich and melodious, echoed the distant lands of whence he came from. His eyes, deep and expressive, sparkled with warmth and wisdom as he reflected on his triumph over past adversary.
Africa? What was it like?
Asked Miss de Gouge as Joseph gave her Olauda's narrative.
Our pineapples, they are about the size of the largest sugar loaf and finely flavored. We have pepper and various delicious fruits not seen in Europe. Honey is in abundance. Everyone contributes something to the common stock, and as we are unacquainted with idleness, we have no beggars. The West India planters prefer the slaves of Benin or Eboy to those of any other part of Guinea, for their hardiness, intelligence, integrity, and zeal. I remember an instance or two when locusts visited us and destroyed our harvest for the year and produced famine.
May I ask, how does one obtain slaves in Africa? I asked. Joseph's intense gaze bore into me as he shot me a look.
Of course, why I wrote my story for questions such as yours, no? Seizing slaves in Africa is common. Kidnapping is more common than any other. When a trader wants slaves, he applies to a chief for them, you see, and tempts him with his wares. It is not uncommon if on this occasion the chief yields to the temptation with as little firmness and accepts the price of his fellow creature's liberty, with as little reluctance as the enlightened merchant.
Oleuda swirled his wineglass around and drank the remaining liquid before continuing.
My mother named me Olauda, which in our language signifies vicissitude, or fortune also, one favored, and having a loud voice and well spoken. As far as I can remember, we were totally unacquainted with swearing, and all those terms of abuse and reproach which find their way so readily and copiously into the languages of more civilized people. The only expressions I can remember were, "May you rot," or "May you swell." My deep affection for my mother compelled me to always be near her during certain times. This led to us being confined in a designated house until we presented an offering for purification. Such is the imperfect sketch. My memory has furnished me with the manners and customs of a people among whom I first drew my breath.
All six of us refrained from continuing to eat our soups. Instead, we leant forward over the table as Mr. Olauda recounted his tales.
"And you say someone kidnapped you?"
asked Godwin, whose eyes became widened with intensity with each sentence.
Yes, sir. If I may.
Olauda looked to Joseph, who smiled and gestured to his guests.
One day, when all our people went out to their works as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls, and in a moment seized us both, and without giving us time to cry out or make resistance, they stopped our mouths and ran off with us into the nearest wood. They tied our hands and carried us until nightfall. We arrived at a small house where the robbers rested and spent the night unbound, but unable to take any food, and being quite overpowered by fatigue and grief, our only relief was some sleep, which allayed our misfortune for a short time.
Did you ever discover who they were?
asked Thomas. Olauda shook his head.
The next day proved a day of greater sorrow than I experienced, for my sister and I were then separated, while we lay clasped in each other's arms. From the time I left my own nation, I always found somebody who understood me till I came to the seacoast. I was sold. 3, maybe 4 times after I arrived, I was transported further along the coast, and arrived at a town where I saw a slave ship anchored, waiting for its cargo.
And then you were sent to America?
asked Olympe.
Yes, madame, America, and through many trials and near-death experiences, I find myself here in this lovely apartment of yours, Joseph, eating dinner with you fine people.
Olauda finished swirling his wine and raised it to the group.
I say, we toast to liberty.
And freedom.
Olympe raised her glass. An aura of defiance and passion flowed into every part of her movement. Unapologetic confidence which commanded attention. To education, Helen and I said in unison.
To resistance against oppression and slavery.
Hear, hear. Everyone raised their glass to Olauda. Olympe took a small sip from her wine.
If women have the right to mount the scaffold.
So we should have the right equally to mount the podium, I added, as both Olympe and Thomas's smiles grew larger as the air became thick with anticipation of philosophical debate.
I shall add that to my paper, madame,
said Olympe, raising her glass to me. Our worries, like an uninvited guest, occupied the empty chairs in quietness. How was the Federation, Helen? I cannot believe you are back. I have not seen you in so long.
Ah, the Fête de la Fédération. Spectacular. I resumed acquaintance with Lafayette. Did I tell you, Joseph?
Joseph smiled and shook his head. Helen rested her spoon on the table.
I shall be able to give you a faint sketch, but your own imaginations must add colouring and spirit to it. If I may?
Each of us around the table nodded as Helen recounted her tale of Paris from the year previous.
The celebrations started on the 13th of July 1790 at the Notre Dame. The overture the musicians played was simple and majestic. Near the conclusion of the piece, the composer produced a melancholy emotion, affecting the audience.
I had never heard anything such as it. There were so many people in the streets.
Neither.
But what added to the effect was the sound of a loud bell, which mixed itself with this awful concert, an imitation of the alarm bell which rung in every church and convent in Paris the day before the taking of the Bastille.
It produced so much confusion in Paris when the bells rang. So many people were running about in terror. It had never happened before that night of the 13th of July in 89.
The audience around me appeared to breathe with difficulty, every heart frozen with terror till the bells ceased. The music then changed its tone to a flourish of drums and trumpets.
And then the fate. Whereabouts were you, Helen?
I seated myself on the right-hand side of the Champs de Mars, 200,000 men walking in procession through arches. 500,000 people assembled at the spectacle, which connected the enthusiasm of moral feelings with the solemn pomp of religious ceremonies. 20 days of labour, enlivened by the enthusiasm of the people, accomplished what would require the toil of years. They worked the Champs de Mars into an immense amphitheatre, where 40 rows of wooden seats, raised one above another with earth, enveloped the arena.
And the distinctions of rank did not appear to matter. I saw everyone in the crowd, soldiers, women.
At the upper end of the amphitheatre, they built a pavilion for the reception of the king, the queen, their attendants and the National Assembly, covered with a striped tent cloth of the national colours and decorated with streamers of the same beloved tints and a fleur-de-lis. They displayed the white flag above the king's seated spot. In the middle of the Champs de Mars, they placed the l'Hôtel de la Patrie, where priests, dressed in long white robes, burnt incense. They wrote several epitaphs on the altar, but the words La Nation, la Loi, et le Roi, the nation, the law and the king, were visible from the greatest distance.
The procession marched to the Champs de Mars, through the streets of Paris. It was monumental. I have never seen something so spectacular in Paris.
In the streets, at the windows, and on the roofs of the houses, the people, transported with joy, shouted and wept as the cortege passed. Old men kneeled in the streets, blessing God they had lived to witness the happy moment. The people ran to the doors of their houses, armed with refreshments which they offered to the troops, and crowds of women surrounded the soldiers and, holding up their infants in their arms and melting into tears, promised to make their children attach themselves to the principles of the new Constitution of France.
And the king and the queen were present.
Asked Joseph. Helen, Olympe and Thomas all nodded.
Of course.
Said Thomas.
They had to be,
added Olympe.
The National Assembly walked towards the pavilion, where they placed themselves with the king, the queen, the royal family. High mass was performed, after which Monsieur de Lafayette, who had been appointed by the king as Major General of the Federation, ascended the altar, gave the signal and himself took the national oath. In an instant, every sword was drawn and every arm lifted up. The king pronounced the oath, which the President of the National Assembly repeated, and 600,000 voices re-echoed the solemn words.
The queen raised the Dauphin in her arms, showing him to the people and the army. The people I'd spoke to said only one subject of regret. Did you find the same, Helen?
Yes, some citizens I spoke to murmured the king took the national oath in the pavilion, instead of performing the ceremony at the foot of the altar.
Monsieur de Lafayette, after the Fédération, went to the Château de la Mouette. I wanted to see him, but it was impossible.
The celebrations lasted for days. The evening of the 14th of July was spectacular.
Ah, yes, the lights and celebrations illuminated the whole of Paris at night.
And during the day, They transformed the ruins of the Bastille, as if it were revived from the dead.
They planted young trees in rows and covered the ground with fresh clods of grass, illuminated with a blaze of light.
I wish to visit one day,
It fills me with horror even considering the possibility.
said Godwin. I shrugged and grinned at Helen, inviting her to proceed.
Once we arrived at the fortress and alighted from the carriage, we descended with difficulty into the dungeons, too low to admit us standing upright. We visited the darkened rooms at noon with the light of a candle, for it would have been too dark otherwise. The sight of the chains and hooks used to restrain the prisoners, many of which, being below the level of the water, left an enduring image in our minds. A noxious vapour promulgated from them, which more than once extinguished the candle, and the air so insufferable it required a deep spirit of curiosity to tempt one to enter.
Good God,
Said Joseph. My stomach squirmed.
And to these regions of horror were human creatures dragged at the caprice of despotic power. What a melancholy consideration there appeared to be a greater number of these dungeons than I could have imagined.
I heard there were tunnels.
Said Thomas.
Me also, Monsieur Paine. So many rumors of the Bastille would circulate Paris every few months.
You are both correct. Only the hard heart of tyranny itself would devise such an idea. Since the destruction of the building, many subterranean cells have been discovered underneath a piece of ground enclosed within the walls of the Bastille. It masqueraded as a bank of solid earth until the horrid secrets of this prison house revealed themselves. A Frenchman told me they found some skeletons in the recesses, with irons still fastened on their decaying bones.
Helen finished her story and silence enveloped the apartment for a few minutes, except for the clinking of spoons on bowls. Imagined horrors of the Bastille flooded my mind as Helen and Olympe whispered to each other about the Bastille in French, whilst Godwin and Paine began a small conversation about America.
Miss de Gouge, the English nation is disposed towards your revolution. Godwin here reminded me of my conversation with Lafayette several months ago.
The English nation is disposed to the progress of liberty, in the entire world, shall I say,
said Godwin. Despite being considered a man of philosophical thought, he spoke few words.
Aye,
said Thomas.
this feeling will become more general in England, as the intrigues and artifacts of its government are better known, and the principles of the revolution better understood.
It surprised me, a nation so enlightened as the French submitted so long to the oppressions of their government. I reflected on the fact a despotic throne can only shine like the radiance of lightning, while everything around it is engulfed in darkness and horror. May no such strong contrast of light and shade again exist in the political system of France again. May the beams of liberty, like the beams of day, shed their benign influence on the cottage of the peasant, as well as on the palace of the monarch.
Aye, well said, Helen. To liberty.
Thomas raised his glass to her and took a sip.
we require a free press in England for any such thing to occur here. I do not have an answer for how to achieve what we require, however.
Nor I replied.
I cannot say for certain, but I believe most English newspapers are on the pay of our government, or at least indirectly connected with it,
said Joseph, who returned to reading one of his pamphlets.
Truth will prevail, Joseph. We cannot prevent the prevalence of truth. Daily falsehoods of those papers no longer have the desired effect. Anyhow, Miss de Gouge, the situation in Paris. The people are talking of war.
Olympe laid her spoon on the table and relaxed back in her chair, pausing for a moment as 5 pairs of eyes stared at her.
Oui, there are, how do you say,
Whispers.
Asked Joseph, glancing up from his paper.
She will partake in war with us?
Again, I said.
Almost certainly, monsieur, from what I've been told.
The Jacobins, they want this, I asked.
Yes, madame. And I believe they will, how do you say, protest women voicing their concerns about the war.
You will still write?
Asked Thomas.
Even though they can, well.
Remorse spread across his face as he traced the top of his wineglass with his finger.
Précisément, monsieur. Précisément. It does not matter to me. They cannot kill us all, eh?
Thomas continued to trace the wineglass with his finger as Godwin spoke first.
And of the king?
Asked Godwin.
The king? Monarchy and succession have laid the world in blood and ashes. 'Tis a form of government, which the word of God bears testimony against, and blood will attend it. They need to banish him, not kill him.
You speak from the heart, monsieur.
France bleeds from the same vein as America once did, and I too.
Aye, and America will flourish. Now the first 20 years of our lives are no more a precedent for the next 20. As I hope you live yours in this new life you have made for yourself.
The two nodded in recognition as we once again returned to our soups for a few moments.
But your King Olympe,
said Olaudah.
Your thoughts on the matter?
The table hushed once again as the flickering candles illuminated Henry's nightmare. One day, I shall have that painting torn down or ripped to shreds.
Louis is guilty as king, but once his title is removed, he shall cease to be guilty in the eyes of our republic,
she replied.
He might have been a virtuous king.
Aye.
Thomas nodded in reply.
Louis made the great nobles pay their debts, and he alone, of all our tyrants, kept no courtesans. He was weak. His court deceived him. He deceived us, and deceived himself.
The Varennes plot is what did them in, slipping into the night and attempting to flee. Only a fool would try.
What will they do? Kill him? I asked. The candles flickered upon the faces of my fellow guests as silence filled the room again. Thomas slumped into his chair in thought as the maid began tidying the soup bowls, replacing them with a small bowl of rice pudding.
Oui, most probably. But there are many, many women and men who shall defend him not as king, but as Louis Capet. He does not deserve to die.
No one deserves to die in the name of liberty. No one.
No one deserves to die in the name of justice and standing for what is right. But here we are.
Thomas and Godwin in thought and Joseph reading allowed ignited conversation once again in a soft, solemn manner.
There are whispers amongst my circle. You are to print the second part of your epistle, Mr. Paine.
Joseph and Thomas glanced at one another as the pamphlet fell from Joseph's hands.
The walls converse,
said Joseph in between small coughs and splutters.
You are correct, but I shall not print it.
Aye,
said Thomas, covering a smile with his hands.
Maybe the walls whisper all the words Joseph mutters to himself when he is frustrated at our writing Mary.
A mumble of laughter resounded from the table as the maid poured more wine. A smile almost appeared on Godwin's face, but I perceived it wouldn't form itself, even if he wished it so. What say you then, Mr. Paine? I asked. The newspapers near called for your head on the first part.
Aye. Naturally they will try again.
Will they follow France's edict and stop seditious publications here, do you think?
Perhaps. Though try as they might, I have far more friends and helpers than they realize.
You must enjoy the notoriety, no. He laughed in reply.
And you, Mrs. Wollstonecraft? I quite enjoyed your first vindication.
Enjoy celebrity? Never. Whilst I quite enjoy the conversations and dining in regular fashion in the closeness of this fine gentleman and his guests. Joseph grinned. I rather find obscurity enjoyable.
But you are writing at the moment?
Joseph's smile grew even larger as his eyes widened. Yes. Narrowing my eyes to Joseph, who hid behind his pamphlet again. The book is near completion and it
is quite the work,
said Joseph, still hiding behind the pages. Thank you, Joseph, but your sentiments are not necessary. It is my truth and shall always be.
So, what are your most favourite parts?
I pondered my thoughts for a moment and scratched at the aging wooden table beneath my fingers. Mere days ago, the jumbled manuscript sat sprawled like a peppering of autumn leaves across this table. Well, I have come to learn through many of my acquaintances, girls who have been weakly educated are often cruelly left by their parents without any provision, and, of course, are dependent on not only the reason but the bounty of their brothers.
And like you, Mary,
said Joseph, flipping over a pamphlet page.
You support your brothers and...
asked William Godwin. The man speaks. Huh? Oh. Well, yes,
And her two sisters.
said Joseph, still behind his pamphlet.
You were telling us about these poor drudges, Mary.
Oh, well, you see, these brothers are usually to view the fairest side of the question. Good sort of men. And give as a favour what children of the same parents had an equal right to. Olympe and Thomas made an attempt at their rice puddings and awaited the continuation of my story. In this equivocal, humiliating situation, a docile female may remain some time, with a tolerable degree of comfort. But, when the brother marries, a probable circumstance, from being considered as the mistress of the family, she is viewed with averted looks as an intruder, an unnecessary burden on the benevolence of the master of the house and his new partner. Everyone around the table sat in thought for a while as they let my words stew in their minds like a bubbling pot of soup. And the wife, a cold-hearted, narrow-minded woman, and this is not an unfair supposition, for the present mode of English education does not tend to enlarge the heart any more than the understanding, is jealous of the little kindness which her husband shows to his relations, and her sensibility, not rising to humanity, she is displeased at seeing the property of her children lavished on an helpless sister.
My dear Mary, I have been telling this for years, years.
One day, Olympe, we shall not be outsiders. Women like us will be educated. They will write and work and be free. Joseph placed his pamphlet on the table and rested his hands on his lap, nodding for me to continue. To prevent any misconstruction, I must add, I do not believe a private education can work wonders. Opinions and manners of society greatly influence the education of men and women.
A type of public education, you could say?
Asked Thomas. Acquiring education is not easy, and I doubt whether any knowledge can be attained without labour and sorrow, and those who wish to spare their children both should not complain if they are neither wise nor virtuous. Paine let out a booming laugh as Olympe and Olaudah joined in the commotion. A sort of smile appeared on William Godwin's face, though I do not think it a true one.
You hold no prisoners in the fort of your mind, Mary. I enjoy it.
It is truth, though, they aim to make their children prudent, and prudence early in life is the cautious craft of ignorant self-love. Olympe spat out her wine.
I am okay.
She laughed a little as she wiped her green and white striped dress.
Do you think we, as a society, shall ever achieve it?
Asked Olaudah as he finished his rice pudding. Once your people are free and girls have access to education, Mr. Aquino, we will have achieved what we have philosophized here tonight. She will stop the progress of knowledge if she is not prepared by education. Truth must be common to all. The fact is, however, men expect from education what education cannot give. The honey must be the reward of the individual's own industry. Trying to make youth wise through someone else's experience is as absurd as expecting the body to grow strong through mere talk or observation. Olaudah and I clinked our glasses and each took another sip of wine.
One day,
said Thomas, raising his glass to me and winking.
And may our friends build our path there.
Olympe, Olaudah, William, Joseph and I smiled together at the mention of friends. The most holy band of society is friendship. I raised my glass and nodded to Joseph. As rare as love is, true friendship is still rarer. He smiled from ear to ear and nodded in acknowledgement as each of us took a sip from our wines.
Let us eat, drink and love, for tomorrow we die.
Joseph took another sip of his wine and winked at me.
I edited your book. You do not think I read what you write?
I giggled at his recital. Friendship is a serious affection, Joseph. The most sublime affection, rooted in principle and fortified by time.
The reverse may be said of love,
said Thomas with a glazed stare.
Mary thinks the same.
I do. Both cannot exist in the same heart. Even when excited by different objects, they destroy each other. They can only be felt in succession, never at the same time.
What is your opinion on love?
Asked Godwin. I rubbed the base of my neck and swirled the remaining drops of wine in my glass. Why do you ask?
I'm curious.
I rested back in my chair and paused to admire the scene of the 6 people around Joseph's table. A philosopher, an editor, a former slave, a Frenchwoman and writer. an Englishwoman and Thomas Paine, the man of many things and many titles. It is better to be disappointed in love than never to love, to lose a husband's fondness than forfeit his esteem. If it be the supreme good, let women be only educated to inspire it, and let every charm be polished to intoxicate the senses. But if they are moral beings, let them have a chance to become intelligent, and let love to man be only a part of the glowing flame of universal love.
And you are writing about this in your recent work?
Asked Olauder. Yes, sir, I replied. My reply to Talleyrand's proposal of education.
Does anyone require more soup before I dish the pastries?
Asked Anne. No, thank you. We countered. Joseph smiled and thanked Anne as she tidied the small bowls from the table and replaced them with small plates of pastries, jams, and various creams.
And what do you suppose women will do in society if they're educated?
Godwin reached for a small pastry and began to tear it apart. What will they do? Well,
You must have some idea.
he said, raising his eyebrows and smiling at me. I paused for a moment and studied his face in detail. They might study the art of healing, be physicians, nurses, midwifery. Though I am afraid the word midwife in our dictionaries will soon give place to a couture and one proof of the former delicacy of the sex be effaced from the language.
They could study politics, no?
Asked Olympe. I nodded and smiled. And business of various kinds, if educated in a more orderly manner. Women would not marry then for support. I do wonder sometimes how many women waste life away in the prey of discontent who might have practiced as physicians, regulated a farm, managed a shop, and stood erect, supported by their own industry, instead of hanging their heads surcharged with the dew of sensibility. Would men snap our chains and be content with rational fellowship instead of slavish obedience, they would find us more observant daughters, more affectionate sisters, more faithful wives, more reasonable mothers, in a word, better citizens. We should then love them with true affection because we should learn to respect ourselves, and the peace of mind of a worthy man would not be interrupted by the idle vanity of his wife, nor his babes sent to nestle in a strange bosom, having never found a home in their mothers.
But how are women to exist, Mary?
Asked Helen.
There is no trodden path to follow.
Precisely my point, Helen. How women are supposed to exist in a state where there is to be neither marrying nor giving in marriage, we are not told. Moralists have agreed the tenor of life proves that man is prepared by various circumstances for a future state. They constantly concur in advising women only to provide for the present. Gentleness, docility, and a spaniel-like affection are consistently recommended as the cardinal virtues of our sex. I remember reading somewhere a writer declared it is masculine for a woman to be melancholy. It is not the government which is defective and unmindful of the happiness of one half of its members.
I like your sentiment.
That it does not provide for honest, independent women and encourage them to fill respectable stations. Let woman share the rights, and she will emulate the virtues of man, for she must grow more perfect when emancipated, or justify the authority which chains such a weak being to her duty.
It angers me, Zoe.
You wrote your pamphlet also on this subject, did you not?
Asked Helen. She did. I read every word. I smiled at Olympe, whose smile beamed. Her face, adorned with her bright blonde wispy hair, bore the traces of both beauty and determination.
What is your opinion? Do you agree with Mary?
Olympe nodded.
Ignorance, neglect, or contempt for the rights of woman are the sole causes of public misfortunes and governmental corruption, in France at least. Woman is born free and remains equal to men in rights. These rights are liberty, property, security, and especially resistance to oppression. Nobody and no individual may exercise authority which does not emanate expressly from the nation. The laws of nature and reason prohibit all actions which are injurious to society. No hindrance should be put in the way of anything not prohibited by these wise and divine laws, nor may anyone be forced to do what they do not require.
And what about representation?
Asked Thomas. Olympe shrugged.
It must be the same for everyone, all citizenesses and citizens, being equal in the nation's eyes, should be equally admissible to all public dignities, offices and employments, according to their ability, and with no other distinction than their virtues and talents. No one should be disturbed for his fundamental opinions.
I remember you wrote something in your declaration about thoughts and opinions of women, and I agree with you.
You mean my expression that a woman can say freely, "I am the mother of your child"?
Yes, so long as a woman does not lie about the paternity of her children. The liberty assures recognition by their fathers.
What I do not understand is how are we supposed to make this so?
Asked Helen.
We can talk about this forever.
Public power.
Said Thomas. You mean institutional laws? I asked.
And any society in which the guarantee of rights is not assured, or the separation of powers not settled, has no constitution,
said Olympe.
Like England.
Precisement, monsieur. The constitution is null and void if the majority of individuals composing the nation have not cooperated in its drafting. How is it fair and just? The torch of truth in France's revolution has not dispersed the clouds of folly and usurpation, though. Our sex has gained no advantages in the revolution. Nothing.
Olympe fiddled with her spoon on the table and flicked it between her fingers whilst she composed her breath.
For centuries of corruption, our sex has reigned over the weakness of men. Now, our empire is destroyed. What is left for us? We have nothing.
They have to want to change, Olympe. It is why I wrote to Talleyrand on the subject of education. If they are educated, at least their minds will be more free.
I do not think legislators will think sanely about the education of women. In France, Madame Mary.
Everyone around the table sat in silence momentarily, sharing in the small samplings of food from Anne. And then, as small conversations broke out between Olympe and Olaudah, as well as William and Thomas, Joseph and I sat in comfortable silence as Anne prepared dessert in the kitchen.
Let us take a quick break, shall we?
Said Joseph.
Anne is preparing some dessert, so best to wander for some air now.